So it was interesting because I was on a panel with a lot of people who don't believe in physical private networks. They're like, you can't use it, but yeah. And then I showed actually down on the usage level in China, which is extremely high. But I don't think my argument was that at the onset, the Great Firewall didn't exist.
Yeah, it was showing some
censorship type of unit. But if you look at it, things like 2008, whenever Rinran came out, Rinran is the Chinese version of Facebook, but of course it's now slightly outdated. You look at it, actually, those crackdowns on Facebook, there used to be able to access Facebook. Then you couldn't, right, whenever a Chinese domestic industry came out. So I think the domestic industry argument, and then the bureaucratic argument, which is that there are a lot of people that get to have jobs, you know. And what any government, particularly the communist one, would be interested in people having jobs, right? And if the Great Firewall ends, then a lot of people lose their jobs. Job security, yeah, job security, welfare, and protecting the domestic industry. Yeah, but I thought it
right. Hi everyone, I guess we'll start from here. So, good morning. Welcome to the second day of the 2015 China-US Symposium. My name is Zhang He. I'm the IR student here. I'm a junior and also study economics. Also panel leader in the CUS. So, I just want to tell a few things about myself. From the first 18 years of my life, I was born and raised in Ningbo. It's a Chinese city I believe most of you have never heard of. Yeah. But I still remember that, 5 years ago, I was buying egg pancakes from scratchy mobile, food carts after school. It's so delicious. But just like in a second, I was here. I speak another language in another country and dress up in fancy suit and tie. So, and my parents both grew up in small and isolated villages, but the opening up of China and its consequent economic growth enabled a fundamental change of their lives. And such a change eventually enabled me to be the first person in my family to study abroad. So, and now I have the privilege to make these remarks here at CUS. You guys know it's like Smashing University, right? So I used to take my growth and China's growth for granted. It was until I was here. It was until I studied IR that I realized how unique China was. What an unprecedented miracle that no country has achieved before. In the US, so I learned the US, and because of the contrast and comparisons, I also learned way a lot about China. Its dream, its potential, and more importantly, also its problems. That's why I really appreciate the CUS, for it allows us to exchange our ideas, and because it also enables us, a group of people from very diverse backgrounds, to gather together and working extremely hard for our common passion. So this being said, I would like to thank you all again for being here for the symposium, and thank you for your willingness to spend this weekend understanding the relations between two greatest countries in the world in this century. And I would like to also thank all the speakers for your presence. And it's for your knowledge and insights that constitute the symposium. So I wish you a joyful weekend, and please enjoy the rest of the symposium. Right, so now we will shift gears and switch to the cultural panel. It's entitled Dancing with Sensitivity, Public Expressions in Modern China. So it will also be me to moderate this panel, maybe just to save the time of introduction. Yeah. I take this panel for an informative crash course that our speakers will bring us through the involvement of different grassroots groups in China. Some are more well-known than the other, and how they emerged, changed, and shaped the Chinese society. So before we go into the panel, I have a very quick note. When listening to the presentation, I encourage you to, besides think from the logic of the citizens from a democratic liberal society, also take China's prior needs and concerns at this stage into considerations. So the bottom line is the logic behind even uncomfortable things might be logical, and we should try to discover and evaluate it beyond making simple judgments. So just to make sure that we have enough time for discussion, each presentation will be about 10 to 12 minutes. Just be precise about it. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, so our first speaker will be Professor Li. Professor Joseph Li is professor of history and co-director of the Global Asian Studies program at Pace University in New York. His latest research focuses on the intersection of faith and politics in modern China. He's the author of the Bible and the Christianity in South China, 1860 to 1900. 圣经与枪炮，基督教与潮州教会。Welcome, Professor Li.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you very much, for having me here at TUF. So I think it's really an honor. I think because of the time, so I think I'm going to focus my a short presentation around these 5 different areas when we talk about the church and state relations in contemporary China. In fact, I think when we think about the whole issue about public expression, I think religion is a very interesting angle to get us to think about the limits of the state control in the culture and also in the religious domain. First of all, so I think in my very brief presentation in this short overview, I'm going to talk about the term issue. When we talk about Christianity, what kind of terminology do we use? How many Christians do we have within China itself nowadays? And also, if you think about the church and state interaction, what would be the most useful working paradigm? And also, what I find interesting, from my fieldwork is there are many interesting changes coming up, from the Chinese grassroots community. So I think at the end, I also would like to say something about the new form of faith-based activism that is also emerging, from China as well. Now, in terms of the terms, I think in the scholarly literature, when we talk about the churches in China, there's also a very interesting distinction between the government church or the open church or the whole house church or the underground church. Now, one thing we have to recognize is I think contemporary Chinese government require all the place of worship to register with the state, whether we are talking about the churches, temple, monastery, or the mosque. So I think within the Christian circle, you have the Catholic and also the Protestant side. Both of them were also recognized as the legitimate religion within China itself. And the other 3 are basically the Buddhist, Taoist, and also Islam. Now, so within the Chinese Christian community, you actually have a top-down infrastructure that was actually created by the state since the Korean War, which is called the patriotic church system. It is actually the only united front organization that still exists from the 1950s up to now. So you have, for some Protestant and Catholic churches, when they join the religious patriotic institution, they actually get the government's license, to own the property and also to create a place of worship. But you also have many, individual, Christian congregations who choose opt out, from this, institutional of control, and this is what we call the house church or the underground church. In fact, I think they are not really underground, in a literal sense. Basically, they can actually have their own property, but they just don't have a government license. So basically, I think that a better terminology would be called the unregistered or maybe the autonomous Christian community. In terms of the Christian population, to be honest, we don't have any reliable, statistic. From China as a whole. If you look at the government data, basically the government tend to underreport the number of the Christian converts, for very practical ideological reason. And some of the data that I got, from the Ministry of Religious Affairs in 2000, you have 20 million Protestant, 5 million Catholic. 2009, the number actually jumped up to 70 million for both. But I think just this year, the government released the data, basically the data for the Catholic and the Protestant remain at 70 million. So I think, the government did not really want to acknowledge any dramatic growth of the Christian body. But I think for some church observer from Hong Kong and also from abroad, I think their estimation, in 2003 is about 70 million Protestant and also 12 million Catholic. And I think by the time of the 21st century, basically people estimate, for the member of the official and also the autonomous churches, basically they make up maybe somewhere around 4 or 5% of China's overall population. But what is the significance of this number? If you compare the Christian figures in 1949, basically we are only talking about 1% of China's population at that time. But since 1949 up to now, during that 5 or 6 decades, when Christianity were completely cut off from the missionary organization, you actually see a dramatic growth of the Christian community. All these were basically deeply indigenous within the Chinese context. Now, when we think about this, religious growth, what would be the most useful working paradigm? I think the old paradigm is we look at this interaction between the state control and also the religious resistance. But if you really look at the control mechanism that was actually developed by the Chinese Communist state, the religious patriotic institutions was the only united front that continued to exist. I think it was actually being institutionalized after the Korean War, when China actually expelled all the missionary and took over all the church institution and also all the mission church properties. And the other thing is, I think if you look at this religious patriotic institution, it actually followed an imperial Chinese tradition, which is actually to control and also to co-opt the religious community. And the main purpose is actually to put them in service of the socialist state. That worked for the Maoist period, because I think during the Maoist time, you actually had a much more nationwide, a much more comprehensive anti-Christian policy. But based on some of the oral history and also the fieldwork research, I noticed that I think from the Maoist era, many local Christians they actually they actually create a wide range of resistance strategy. One good example is they go back to their family tradition. They actually use the family network, the lineage network, to organize all these house churches within the countryside and also sometimes in the city as well. When the anti-Christian climate became more intense, they basically just shift their operation to the countryside. So basically, they were actually following the Maoist ideas of guerrilla warfare. And they also expand the church by converting the victims of the Maoist reform during the Great Leap Forward and also the Cultural Revolution. Basically, it made it easier for them to use the Christian message to appeal to the victims of the socialist policy. And I think for those Christian community along the Guangdong and also the Fujian coast, it also made it easier for them to reach out to the overseas Chinese and also to get all this kind of help through smuggling during the 1960s and 70s from Hong Kong. So it was actually through that kind of survival strategy. You can actually see the local churches, they survived the Maoist era of persecution. And during the reform era, they actually rebuilt themselves. And this is one example, they actually built a bigger one compared with the old village churches, the old lineage churches that they have in the 19th century. And the same thing, within the Catholic circle as well. But one major difference within the Catholic circle was because of the Vatican issue. So I think that external policy also divide the Catholic community, into the open government church and also the unofficial churches. Now, what are the latest developments in the in Chinese Christianity? For those people who survived the persecution era, they actually define the Christian movement as a religion of suffering, and they love to use that term 吃苦, having tasted bitterness, to talk about their experience from the Maoist era. And this is actually one of the great quotes that I got from a church leader. We were bombarded with all this kind of anti-Christian propaganda. We did not swallow it, we actually survived. And I think for many of these survivors, they actually rejoin the patriotic institution. But what they did this time was they actually hijacked that kind of state structure to reclaim some of their lost property and also to empower the local Christians as well. So I think during my fieldwork, one of the interesting phenomena was in all the major cities and also sometimes even in the countryside, we do see some interesting overlap membership between the official church and also the underground church. So in a way, there was there were more overlap and also more collaboration than conflicts and competition. And the other interesting thing is, I think during the reform era, you actually have many peasants in the remote area who did not benefit from the reform policy. And I think some of them actually subscribe to certain type of the Christian teaching, like especially the eschatology, to talk about their own suffering, to talk about some of the social injustice as well. And you actually have a wide range of Christian-inspired sectarian movement that actually emerged from the Chinese hinterland. And I think the government actually identified maybe 40 of them, and they actually imposed a very heavy crackdown. But still, I think most of these sectarian groups, they continue to function in the countryside. And I think the most famous one is actually called the Eastern Lightning. They actually talk about a female Christ already returned to China now, and I think that would be that should be the focus of their religious salvation. So basically, some of their teaching can be a little bit very different from the Orthodox Christianity. But what you see is some kind of creative strategy to deal with all the uncertainty and also insecurity of the reform. For those people who were doing well in major cities like Shanghai, Guangzhou, and also Beijing, you also see a new type of Christian who subscribe to this gospel of prosperity. and what I call them the CEO Christian or the boss Christian. They were the one who actually see there's a direct connection between their faith practice and also their material award. And I think for some of these boss Christian, they were the major patron of some of these well-elaborated churches in urban China. And the other interesting thing is, they also try to use their economic status to mediate and also to negotiate with the local authority for more influence and also for more access to the church property. So this is actually some of the image that you see. All these new churches, they were actually being built, with the economic support of the boss Christian. And the most interesting trend that I noticed is actually you also have a number of new converts, especially after the Tiananmen during the 1990s. Basically, they feel very disappointed with the result of the Tiananmen massacres, and you actually see a dramatic growth of a conversion that is actually happening among the Chinese intellectual circle. First, from the Chinese university, high school, and 10 years later, all these Christian intellectual, they become lawyer, journalist, editor, and publisher. And I think they also began to organize a wide range of social activities. I think they were extremely critical of the authoritarian system within China, and I think they also want to explore the public role of the church in the fast-changing society. So here is actually one of the most well-known example of a group of urban Christians in Beijing. I think they really want to get some kind of a legal recognition from the state. When they fail to get that. They actually organized some kind of public worship just at the time of President Bush and also President Obama's visit to China. And I think it actually got lots of attention. And I think eventually they also try to force the Beijing municipal authority to the negotiation table. And I think in recent years, you also have many interesting cases about church demolitions in one Chinese province of Fujian. What I found interesting is I think for the local government authority, they actually shift the discourse. They actually shift the anti-Christian discourse from the old ideas of the cultural conflict between East and West to condemning the church now for violating the building law or the building regulation. And what they did was they basically just go to some of these major church sites and basically tell the Christian to remove their cross and also to remove some of their bell tower. And I think on many occasions, you actually have huge confrontation between the local Christian and also the government authority. This is actually one of the most interesting cases that actually happened in the summer of 2012. And it actually happened in a remote area just outside Wenzhou. And I think that case, it was actually one of the first cases that the government actually used the zoning regulation to force the Christian to remove some of their architecture. And I think this incident actually became a precedent for more high-profile cases in Wenzhou, during the 2013 and also 2014 as well. So I think to the Christian, I think once they were being told to remove the cross, basically to them it is almost like losing their identity. Just imagining if you tell a communist government official to remove the portrait of Mao from the government building. So basically, in some of these cases, you actually have many violent confrontation between the local Christian community and also the local government official as well. Even though there's no dramatic institutional change from top down, but by looking at some of this, dispute, what I find interesting is, for those church, especially some of these urban churches, they were already part of the system. They began to question if the religious patriotic institution cannot actually help them to gain legal recognition. Maybe they should actually opt out, from the state, and also maybe trying to organize some kind of grassroots mobilization. So they began to have that kind of dialogue. And we don't know, where that dialogue will lead. But you do see some interesting bottom-up effort that actually want to initiate some kind of change within the Chinese church and state system. So in terms of some of the general conclusion, I would say basically I think the China story represents a very interesting shift when we talk about Christianity. Basically, the center of the Christian movement, is moving towards the global south. And I think China is a major part of the transformation. And the other thing is, when we think about the state, whether we're talking about the Maoist state, the Deng Xiaoping era, and even today's Xi Jinping, I think one of the major problems is, the old system of control is actually broken. So what you have now is how are they going to accommodate and also adjust to the rising expectations of a new generations of the urban Christian. because I think the kind of Christian population that they're dealing now is very different from the Maoist period. And I think just on a final note, in terms of the border crossing activism, one thing that I noticed is I think during the umbrella movement, you have many Hong Kong Christians, they were mobilizing themselves in public. But when I was doing my own oral history, I noticed that we also have many Chinese volunteers who actually help out in some of these Christian occupied sites in Hong Kong as well. And basically, you actually see some interesting dialogue and also cultural exchange between the two groups about how to organize faith-based activism at the next stage. So thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lee. Actually, Professor Lee told me that he took a lot of pictures in the slide by himself in Wenzhou. So yeah, I'm really impressed by Professor Lee's dedication to the field. Okay, so our next speaker will be Ms. Goldman. So Anna Goldman, or Guailing, is a writer and translator of Chinese literature. She's a research associate at the Fairbanks Center at Harvard University and spent a year at Peking University on Fulbright Fellowship. She has been an artist in residence at the American Academy in Rome and was awarded Henry Liu's Translation Fellowship from the Vermont Studio Center. Her book of translation, Something Crosses My Mind, Selected Poems of Wang Xiaomi, was the recipient of a 2013 TEN translation grant. Welcome.
Thank you. It's a delight to be here. Thank you all for coming on Saturday morning. And thank you to Xiaoyue and Jiahe for inviting me. It's really a delight. So I will be very quick and very brief. Okay, so let's start. I know it's Saturday morning, but let's start with a quiz. Does anybody recognize any of these people? Okay, these are some of the most prominent Chinese poets writing today in Chinese. So the fact that none of us know them, let's just keep that in mind. But that's not actually what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about something that relates in some ways to Professor Lee's fascinating talk about Christianity. Two aspects that were very prominent in his talk were the limits of state control and creative strategies, which is a great phrase, to expression. And those things were directly relate to literature in general, publishing in general, but poetry in particular. And I'll talk about a few instances. None of these people. The gentleman on the top right there, or top left, excuse me, Beidao, he has been one of the people rumored to be on the Nobel list for many years. So remember his face. And then Zhai Yongning, Sichuan, who had a very prominent book of poems translated called Notes from the Mosquito, Yu Xia, and then in the middle is Zhu Zhang, who's actually been to the States many times to read. So you should look for her next time she's here. So I want to talk first about Zhang Di. Zhang Di is a scholar. He is a professor at Beida at Peking University. He is known as one of the 知识分子诗人, or 图书馆诗人, depending on how pejorative you want to be. His work is highly allusive. It's highly intellectualized, very interested in the nuts and bolts of language. But I want to talk about a slightly different aspect of his work, which is his interest in the concept of work. So work in China, or really anywhere, is a surprisingly fraught idea, because it very easily leads into conversations about things like migrant workers, about farmers, about problems with huge disparities in wealth distribution, in issues of compensation, et cetera, issues that we very much have here in the States as well. But in China, the conversation is more stifled. Nevertheless, there's a lot going on in literature, and it gives us a entryway to see how people are looking at this issue in varied ways. So this is a poem that Zhang Di wrote a year ago last September, so in September 2013, when Chen Qimi, very important Irish poet, Nobel winner, died. And Zhang Di wrote this as a kind of tribute. But it's also about the issue of work. So after the New Society for Wisdom, the love of Ireland, far enough but not unfamiliar, with every dig Ireland's workades follow that new wisdom, and find in the language of loneliness supreme support, etc. I don't have time to read the whole thing, it's gorgeous. I'm going to talk, these translations are online, I'm going to talk about the English translation, but for those of you who can read the Chinese, I want to give it to you also. So Ireland, he starts with a language play. He's in the nuts and bolts of the language. Then later, Ireland, so he's taking it apart, which is a very sophisticated strategy. Also, just incidentally, totally heartbreaking, because Ireland is beautiful. The land of Ireland is gorgeous, but then you lose land, the orchid, in the translation. I chose orchid, but maybe that was the wrong decision. I could talk for 3 hours about just translating this poem. I won't, I promise. So what does this poem refer to? This digging, 挖掘, is a very famous poem of Sheng Xing's, which inaugurated his career, his career as a poet, really. It's the first poem in The Death of a Naturalist, which was published in 1966. And it talks about he, as a writer, looking at his father, who was a potato farmer. And his father is doing backbreaking work of digging up potatoes. And he has his pen. And he says, I'll dig with this. So writing as work, intellectual work, as something that also produces 汗水, the sweat of intellectual endeavor and artistic endeavor, which really is the center of Zhongyi's life and one of his central artistic concerns. Moving on, Wang Tianyi. So the next poem I want to talk about is from my translation of Wang Tianyi. She is about the same age as Zhang Di. She's a contemporary of Zhang Di, but although she has taught in university, she's not a professor. She's very intelligent, but I wouldn't necessarily call her an intellectual. She's extremely well-read, but she's not as interested in philology and the origin of words and in Chinese as a linguistic structure. But she's very interested in work also. I should say these are all excerpts. Those two are excerpts. There's a lot more to these poems. So this is not the beginning of the poem, but November's rice gleaners. Still, there are always people at dusk looking like bent black nails. Who will come to admire the ancient sorcery of rice gleaners turning a bit of gold into a grain of rice? So this is also talking about work. She's on the train. She's seeing it through the window. So she's at a remove, she's at a distance, but she's very concerned about how these people are being treated. Is it possible to actually live in countryside and farm and make any kind of living at all that's other than a subsistence, very poor subsistence lifestyle, which is still very much the way a lot of rural China still lives, which is something that gets lost in, at least in the Western conception of China, is this, oh, Shanghai, it's Beijing, it's Shenzhen, it's these huge buildings, and it is. But it's also, a lot of the countryside is this, people still farming rice by hand, right? Which is incredibly laborious. So she also has sweat here. I want to call for them to stand up, to see the faces worth the least gold, to see the color of sweat they produce. So unlike Zhang Di, who has an extremely intellectualized idea of work, Wang Tianyi sees work. She's at a remove from it, but she sees physical labor. She's very interested in how these people are surviving. Here's the Chinese, very briefly, moving on. Does anybody recognize this poet, Mr. Richard? He was a Foxconn worker. He committed suicide, Tiao in 2013, and became sort of a sensation because he was 24 at the time when he killed himself from rural Guangdong. Essentially had not received any education at all, and yet had read, was fascinated by books, and was fascinated by poetry, and wrote his own really quite surprising, wonderful poetry. I swallowed an iron moon. I swallowed an iron moon, they called it a screw. I swallowed industrial wastewater and unemployment forms. Bent over machines, our youth died before its time. I swallowed labor, I swallowed poverty, swallowed pedestrian bridges, swallowed the trust about life I can't swallow anymore. Everything I've swallowed whirls up in my throat. I spread across my country a poem of humiliation, which is very powerful. From a technical perspective, this poem is not as literarily accomplished as Ivory Gondi's or Montaigne, but it's very powerful because it is first person. I mean, all of these poems are first person, but this is a worker. This is somebody who stood on the unemployment lines, who stood on the assembly lines, who dealt with screws personally, and it's in the nouns. It's in these very specific nouns of work: industrial wastewater, unemployment forms, machines, labor, poverty, pedestrian bridges, which is so great. It's kind of surprising, and yet you can see it. This is a really simple, difficult life. Given the time, I'll just finish by saying I'm not trying to make any comment on any kind of qualitative comparison. I think all three of these poets are doing something very important and very accomplished. And they're talking about a social issue that is extremely fraught today in China. It's a 敏感问题, this question of disparity of wealth, of migrant workers, et cetera, of these young people who come to Foxconn, to work at Foxconn, and with broken hands or committing suicide. There have been something like a dozen suicides in the last year alone of people who work, young people who are working in these factories. So these three poets are finding a voice, finding a way to talk about this issue that is getting published. You can read these poems online. They are published in, this poem in particular, 2 years after he committed suicide, this was published in a very prominent newspaper in Shenzhen. So they are managing to have their voices heard, and through them bring this issue to life in a way that is actually quite effective. Thank you very much.
So our next speaker will be Professor Peggy Wang. So Peggy Wang is an assistant professor of art history and Asian studies at Bowdoin College. Her research has been supported by Javits and Fulbright Hays fellowships and centers on how meanings and histories of art have been constructed in light of cultural globalization. She's currently completing a book and study on artists' strategies of social political intervention in contemporary Chinese art from the 1990s onwards. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, especially thanks to Lynette for inviting me. So I'll just get started, but I feel like I've already learned so much from these panelists. And I also want to speak to some of these same issues about creative strategies, as well as something that was brought up at the end of Professor Lee's talk, which is that we're talking about different generations of artists. Who come from those who were born in the 60s versus 70s versus 80s. They have different backgrounds to draw on. And so we have different ways even in which we can think about the trajectory of public expressions and how political sensitivities are based on people's own experiences or lack of experiences, we can say too. Ai Weiwei is probably the most famous contemporary Chinese artist that people know, and known primarily because he was arrested and then spent 81 days in jail since 2000. This is a clip from its 2012 documentary, Never Sorry. And in it, you can see his obsession with documentation, with archiving in a way in which he sees a way of showing truth, particularly in the face of, say, surveillance by Big Brother. So a way in which people, through, say, grassroots activism, calling people to do that through Weibo or Twitter or whatnot, to do their own citizen investigations. That was what really put him on the radar of the government, and then subsequently he was jailed, and he's become the most vocal kind of artist activist. this is positive in a way, right? It brings attention to real issues in which we have exhibitions that do get shut down, artists that do get jailed. On the other side, however, it does overshadow some of the more nuanced works or other types of artworks that are being exhibited and produced in China in a way that people might not seek out a more diverse and comprehensive view of contemporary Chinese art production and exhibition. And instead, when this becomes a view, in a lot of ways it reaffirms Western views of what China is. And that way it does have a very negative effect, I would say, that people then don't look beyond. So if you have shows of a contemporary Chinese artist at Smithsonian, the artist that they choose is Ai Weiwei, when there are plenty of other really wonderful artists who deserve shows that also show maybe a more nuanced way of thinking about the limits that we've been talking about, as well as kind of creative strategies. All right. That said, I think to situate him, I'm going to go briefly back in time to talk about some of these strategies that have been used and to show us kind of a trajectory of what the status of contemporary Chinese art has been over time. In the 1990s, there was a great deal of political sensitivity, particularly following Tiananmen. Installation art and performance art in particular were banned, partly because they could not be vetted beforehand. There's these kind of very transient mediums that are just, at that time, they're what's produced. Performance art was sometimes tied into issues about using the body and possibly pornography if it was the naked body. Also, there was a sense that if you do performance art, that could perhaps generate like a spontaneous demonstration or protest, this inability to control. And for that reason, we do have examples of artists being jailed during the 1990s for doing performance art. Or we have exhibitions of installation art that are prematurely shut down. The reasons not being that, I mean, they weren't listed for that. They might say it's a fire hazard. They might say you don't have the correct residency permit, but we do have cases of that happening. But then we also, but we do have ways in which artists do have strategies in which they are able to present their work to their fellow colleagues or through word of mouth, sometimes Western journalists, whoever they was within that group. And so one phenomenon in the 90s is apartment art. So those who lived in Beijing, who had homes in Beijing, they might open up their house and to their friends for a certain amount of time, like this day from 5 to 7, come over and see my work. And in this work, Wang Gongxing has actually created he's dug a hole into his home and he put a video at the bottom of it, and it's this kind of video installation. And his wife Ling Tianmao also did an installation in their bedroom. And so you have also very intimate private spaces that are made a little bit kind of semi-public, I wouldn't say really public, but there's a way in which people are working with the spaces around them, what's available to them. Temporary interventions like Zhanwang. So throughout the 90s, we know because of mass urbanization, particularly in Beijing, and modernization, you have the demolition of homes in order to widen streets and whatnot. And so Zhanwang comes across this home that is in the middle of being demolished, knowing full well at the end of the day it's going to be finished, but he takes this time, just a few hours, to try to restore this one column, so it's kind of ruin cleaning, as a way of showing the kind of futility of human agency and care for people at a time when you know very well things are, the accelerated pace of life and the speed of modernization, things are moving forward, and the lack of preservation as a result. So you have these ways in which artists, they're still going out and doing these things that do have a sense of political sensitivity. We can say a kind of critique, but not necessarily overt. And he's just performing this little independent individual piece and having it photographed as well. The question is, then how do more people know about it, right? So we talk about apartment art as one form of circulating imagery. Another way, or circulating one's work, if people will go see it. Another way of circulating was through text, right? Since installation and performance themselves are these temporary transient mediums, what you could do is create little postcard-sized text of one side of it being an image, the other side being description of it, and sending this out to people and saying, look, this is what's happening in Beijing, in Shanghai, in Guangzhou, wherever, and you get a sense of these We have kind of these alternative exhibition platforms as a result. And then you also have these underground books, publications that themselves have a lot of, this is the black cover book, white cover book, gray cover book, 94, 95, 97. They were privately sponsored and then distributed. As we know, in China, if you want to publish a book to register, like with an ISBN number, you have to do it through the government, but they were able to do this themselves. So you have, again, these unofficial platforms. Since 2000, there's been an immense political loosening, and part of this comes out of the fact that the recognition that contemporary Chinese art has a certain cachet, and it can make a statement about one's cultural advancement within an international global community. And so with the Shanghai Biennial, for example, a quote from there is, "The Shanghai Biennial set a good example for our Chinese colleagues and is bound to secure its due status among other world famous biannual art exhibitions," right? So things like the Venice Biennial, which in 2005, China had the first pavilion there. And so in a sense, like the China pavilion can go alongside of the German pavilion, American pavilion, right? So this idea that one is joining, can use contemporary Chinese art to join a larger community and see themselves there. If people have been to 798 in Beijing, this is what it looked like in 2003, just a few artist studios that were open, a few placards, 2005. And then after Sotheby's had their enormous successful sale of contemporary Asian art in 2006, 798 continued to explode. We have making the covers, making news within New York Times, Art News, all discussions about contemporary Chinese art, then really taking over the art market. And then 798 continues to explode. And it says, by the end of 2007, it was decided that the area would continue in its current format of a special art zone. And since 2009, new galleries have opened and a cafe culture is emerging. So if you go there, it's really enormous. And there are way more placards here. In 2003, when we would go and say, take me to Chijiuba, we'd be like, is that a bar? Is that a jiuba? They have no idea what it is. And now everybody knows what 798 is. You see. And you have a great deal of, public art, public, for sale, but art that is publicly shown here. A Pace gallery is there, so you have a lot of blue chip galleries. Comparison to 2004, 2011. Songzhuang Artist Village, kind of on the outskirts, but you see here that there's immense effort to kind of show more and more of this infrastructure, including private art museums. So you have now a new generation of kind of young contemporary Chinese collectors who are then opening up their own art museums. And quickly, another thing we can think about in terms of the growth of contemporary Chinese art is reaching a larger global audience and new platforms for that as well. So for example, Feng Mengbo, even back in 2002, he made his own version of Quake, where he put his own body into the video. And then at the opening and throughout the duration of the show, people could play him while he was in Beijing, right? So there's ways of then reaching globally and not just thinking about contemporary Chinese art within China. So there you see here. Cao Fei, she goes by her avatar named China Tracy. She created an entire city called R&B City in the now antiquated, now passé, but the time Second Life, which is where kind of a virtual realm where you could create your own cities. And she would say, have interviews with people from galleries and museums as an avatar online, right? And then she would rent out spaces where museums could buy and show work. So like the Guggenheim, for example, bought a little bit of space within R&B City and showed virtually some work there. So these are ways in which they're thinking, other platforms, virtual platforms, reaching larger audiences. This brings us back to Ai Weiwei, where he talks about Twitter in this way of thinking about, it's my favorite city, and I can reach all sorts of people. And in that way, he does then offer us an interesting way of thinking about, if we think of him alongside of China Tracy and Feng Mengbo, yes, it is a way then reaching globally outwards. Some more images. And recently he's because he still continues to be this like thorn in the side of the government, and so in Shanghai and in Beijing, there were these group exhibitions, and they were asked to, the gallery and the UCCA, they were asked to remove his work from it, and so they subsequently removed also his name from the press release, and then Ai Weiwei took to social media and listed a whole kind of transcript between his discussion with the curator to try to expose the ways in which these institutions are then kind of kowtowing to the government. But just a final note is that is one view of it, and he continues to be this very kind of vocal view about what contemporary Chinese art is. But I think that, again, that overshadows and neglects to look at some other artists, and in fact, the post-1980 generation, as in the generation of the youngest generation, I'll say, those who were born after 1980, born after the Cultural Revolution, they have very little interest, actually, in a lot of this kind of like political stance. And just a few examples: Lu Yang, her cancer baby, a lot of kind of tongue-in-cheek, dealing with animation. Li Ming, this is just to show the vast variety. Li Ming, he's a video artist, and throughout this entire video, this guy is just spraying something that continually comes back at him in the face. Sun Xun is an animator. He creates this vast kind of video animations, but you can see the huge installation here. He talks about history. What's interesting, he talks about authoritarianism in history, but he doesn't talk about in terms of, my history. He talks about his father's generation history. So we're talking about kind of a removal already from Cultural Revolution and an interest in that. And Li Liao, to kind of go to the Foxconn view, Li Liao, born in 1982, he's from Shenzhen, and he actually became hired, so he became employed by Foxconn, and he worked there for 45 days until he could afford to buy an iPad mini. And so that was his performance, right? And so maybe going back to these issues about labor and work, and we can see political criticism, sensitivity there, but it's not that kind of overt Ai Weiwei kind of view. So that.
So last but not least, we have Ivan Rasmussen. Ivan Rasmussen is a PhD candidate at the Fletcher School and a recent fellow in the Belfast Center's International Security Program. Ms. Rasmussen focuses on Chinese external relations, international negotiations, and U.S. foreign policy. Ms. Rasmussen also currently works for the Grand Corporation on China-Asian relations and recently accepted a faculty position at Cambridge College. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thanks. So I'm a little bit of the outlier of the group because I'm not exactly in the translation or art world. Well, we'll see what kind of world I'm in just a second. But I think that Java invited me here because last year I spoke here, and actually I was thinking about it. This is my 5th year that I've either been around this area and attended or been able to speak at this great China-US Symposium writ large. And I think that he invited me because I made a very controversial argument last time that the Great Firewall of China is 1, not so great, and 2, not really used for censorship in the same level. So hopefully I can do so. I actually made everybody on the panel with me really angry, and I might be making Gordon Chang right now angry because we'll see what he has to say in the lecture. But I made the argument that it's basically for bureaucratic politics and for much more a protection of domestic industries. So hopefully I won't make the panel too angry, and I'll be able to situate things in a different context. This is actually something that I'm interested in, which is much more about literature outside my dissertation, outside my work on international relations. My original plan was to talk about Ai Weiwei and Bo Xilai, and actually my argument was that the Bo Xilai picture that you see down here is actually a piece of artwork more than anything else. But the only reason I'm mentioning this is if you want to talk about Ai Weiwei, and if you want to talk about Bo Xilai, I'm willing to do so. I will defer on Ai Weiwei to Professor Wang, because that's her territory. That's why I stopped and do this presentation. My expertise on Ai Weiwei is only because I dated someone at his at his studio for a little while. But rather than Shirk Hu, I have a problem with Shirk Su. So that didn't work out. Instead, I'm going to talk a little bit today about China's silent majority and the emergence of politics and art. I'm going to start with a quote from Mao Zedong, and then I'm going to move through 3 or 4 pieces of Chinese literature that I think are very, very interesting. You'll notice they're all short because that's the only ones I can read, and they're very simple language, like Wang Xiaobo is like very easy, basic Chinese for me, and also very raunchy literature, which is fun too. So I'm going to work through these little pieces of literature. I'm going to start with a quote from Mao Zedong, which is that literature and art are subordinate to politics. I'll say it again because I think it's a very interesting quote, and we'll come back to what that means. And I'm going to make the argument in China that that's true in a lot of different forms, whether they want it to or not, and that I'm not sure how I feel about it, but you should all be thinking about this. So again, literature from Mao and art are subordinate to politics. Now, with this whole story of politics and art, whoa, I'm just going to go crazy right now. I'll talk about Walter Benjamin or all this kind of this long history. But I want to start because I'm the last PPT. People it's morning time. You know, I hope you guys had a fun Friday night, but not too fun, right? And this politics and art thing, you want to stretch yourselves out. You want to think a little bit about Charlie Chaplin. Why Charlie Chaplin? I'm going to get to China in a second. Don't worry about this. Charlie Chaplin is a very interesting character in this debate, in this modern stage, and I'll work through China in a similar kind of way, where that blending of politics and art, in this case movies, happens. So I'm going to do a clip in just a second, and I know I'm going to go over my time limit, and I'm going to get in trouble. But what do people know about Charlie Chaplin? Well, of course, you know, famous comedian, you know, kind of falling all over the place like I tend to do whenever I lecture. And most notably, his films begin in the silent era and then move to a modern era where there's noise. But what does Chaplin do? Well, he remains silent in the vast majority of his films. People are aware of this, right? You guys all have this image of Charlie Chaplin being fed into a machine in the modern age, or kind of skating around and falling down a precipice. There's actually a very famous, one of his most famous movies is called The Great Dictator. And in this movie, he speaks. We hear Charlie Chaplin's voice for the first time. Crazy, right? It's not like it was an impossible thing to happen. I'm going to click. This is Charlie Chaplin finally speaking. I didn't always speak, right? But when I did, I gave one of the greatest speeches of all time. And if you take anything away from this, it's worth rewatching this. Hopefully the noise will come through, which would be ironic, wouldn't it? Give it 1 second. It's going to be about 4 minutes.
I'm sorry, but I don't want to be an emperor. That's not my business. I don't want to rule or conquer anyone. I should like to help everyone if possible. Jew, Gentile, black man, white. We all want to help one another. Human beings are like that. We want to live by each other's happiness, not by each other's misery. We don't want to hate and despise one another. In this world, there's room for everyone, and the good earth is rich and can provide for everyone. The way of life can be free and beautiful. But we have lost the way. Greed has poisoned men's souls, has barricaded the world with hate, has goose-stepped us into misery and bloodshed. We have developed speed, but we have shut ourselves in. Machinery that gives abundance has left us in want. Our knowledge has made us cynical, our cleverness hard and unkind. We think too much and feel too little. More than machinery, we need humanity. More than cleverness, we need kindness and gentleness. Without these qualities, life will be violent, and all will be lost. The aeroplane and the radio have brought us closer together. The very nature of these inventions cries out for the goodness in men, cries out for universal brotherhood, for the unity of us all. Even now, my voice is reaching millions throughout the world. Millions.
Okay, so I have to cut it a little bit short, but if you have time, go back. It's a very powerful speech, right? And obviously, Chaplin who does he look like? Well, he looks like Adolf Hitler, right? This is very specific. He's framed himself. He's the accidental step-in for Hitler, and he gives this fantastic speech that's all about how he wants the world to be a good place. And he has traversed into politics with his art, right? The very moment whenever Chaplin finally speaks, he traverses into politics, and it's for us. It sounds like a good politics, right? It's everybody's equal, everybody's working together. but I'm gonna ask a question whether or not that's something we want to that art should be doing. And now let's get to the Chinese context. Okay, so now everybody's woken up, a little bit of jokes about Charlie Chaplin, hopefully motivated a little bit to watch this video. Great film, of course. Let's talk about China in terms of this blend of politics and art, because there's a different kind of story, but it's similar to the Chaplin one. This is an image here from a recent meeting by Xi Jinping of one of the new set. This is again a story of somebody we don't know, but we should know, I think, learn to know for different reasons, of writers in China. A set that includes Zhou Xiaoping, Hua Qinfeng. These are the nationalist writers, right? The idea is that they're writing literature, as Mao would say this, and as Xi calls upon them, with positive energy. It has this positive, good energy that feels good about what? About the state, about the nation, about being Chinese. This kind of energy comes from, I would say, a politicization of art that is long-standing in China, and particularly salient historically and currently. This is a picture of Lu Xun. My Chinese friends always remark that they don't read Lu Xun anymore, which is really sad. For me, it's actually a good thing to read in Chinese, because a lot of this stuff is pretty short and pretty intense and has some great stories to it, right? So the idea that literature has to convey some sort of political meaning, and for Lu Xun, it was challenging what it meant to be Chinese, is important. And I'm going to talk about it not in the context of Lu Xun, but also in the context of three pieces of literature, historically situated, but I think that tell a story about China and Chinese national identity that's very, very important to the current era. The first one is Yu Dafu's Sinking. So Yu's Sinking is, you guys don't know it, it's again short because my Chinese is not good enough to read longer stuff, and the next one is going to be long, but I read it in translation, oops. But it's, so Yu's Sinking is a story, semi-autobiographical, about a young man who does study abroad. But where does he do study abroad? This is written in 1920, 21. You can probably take a guess, but in Japan. He goes to Japan and he thinks to himself, and he gets horribly anxious to an extreme level, to a level where he seeks out a prostitute, he's losing his mind, all this other kind of stuff, and at the end, it seems like he's going to kill himself, or he did kill himself. So Yu's confronting this modern Chinese identity vis-a-vis Japan. Japan is much more developed. He feels like a backwards Chinese man entering into the world, right? Really fascinating development that in China's early modern period of time, it's this anxiety about the nation that plays out in literature, and it's a critique. It's a critique of what it means to be Chinese. This is 1921, so well, you know, why is I stuck in the 1920s, you know, the Roaring 20s or whatever, not necessarily in China, right? But let's move forward a little, because I think this theme plays out more, and then we're going to I'll conclude with why I think there are a couple of big takeaways in the current scheme about literature and art and national identity. The second kind of piece of work is a longer piece by Zhang Xianliang, and this is the story of half of man is woman. This is Zhang's story, again, semi-autobiographical, about another historical crisis in the Chinese identity, and this historical crisis was him going to work in the rural areas during the Cultural Revolution. Fantastic book, very complicated book, but in this he again encounters a level of male sexual impotency. He can't, you know, he can't get married. He's anxious about his life. He's overly intellectual, and all of this is because the Chinese state has repressed him, or because the Chinese state, at least as I've argued in other places, the Chinese state in this national narrative are kind of is weak to the outside, because all it has to do is resort to cultural revolution, right? This is written in the 1980s, 1986, 87, depends on publication dates, but so Zhang's story, which is again autobiographical, is years spent in the countryside and the limitations of the Chinese state and the nation in terms of these things. Again, politicizing things as a critique of China to some degree, right? Here, this is a Wang Xiaobo, who's much easier to read because of the shortness and because of the raunchiness of the literature. But Wang Xiaobo, this is a statue of Wang Xiaobo and the young artist, I forgot the name, who developed this. He's strategically covering up a very erotic element of the picture, because Wang Xiaobo dealt with these things of eroticism. So in a couple of his short novellas, sadly, of course, for those of you who know anything about Wang Xiaobo, passed away, and you know, great literary, a great writer. A couple of short stories show again this anxiety. There's one called 2015. And this story, again, we'll go kind of traverse the art and politics type story. This story is of a young guy who's kind of like, sounds like it's Wang Xiaobo, whose uncle is an artist, who's starting to become part of the art scene, is making tons of money by making these really horrible pieces of art that make everybody sick. And so his uncle's making these art, and then he's this anxious young artist and writer, and he's seeing his great uncle making people sick and all this other kind of stuff. And the uncle has this cultural revolution background, having been through it. And in this way, Wang Xiaobo was also critiquing it. And in a different way, if you want to read some nuance on this, on critiquing the idea of using literature to advance a political position either against the Chinese state or for the Chinese state, Wang Xiaobo writes another great short story called The Golden Age. Has anybody read this? Okay, so Golden Age is really, it actually takes the Cultural Revolution and turns the typical idea of the Cultural Revolution, horrible thing, right? Wang Xiaobo in Golden Age thinks this Cultural Revolution is fantastic. Why? Because in the semi-autobiographical story, this character goes to the countryside and basically has sex and enjoys life, and it's perfect. There's no rules, is what he says in the Cultural Revolution. You just go to the countryside and have a good time. So he's critiquing those who are over politicizing art. So where does this all bring us, right? Now to 2015, not just the story of Wang Xiaobo, but also this moment, right? Here's Xi Jinping being depicted in this lovely kind of representation of minorities in China. What a great country. He's kicking a soccer ball with great vigor, right? So the question facing China in the past and moving forward is, what role does literature play and art play in the national memory and in the national consciousness? And I made the argument, at least kind of topically, because we don't have enough time, that role has been to both critique, but also to, in some ways, try and unravel why China has gone through this period of national humiliation, this century of national humiliation. And so now art and literature is being called by the Chinese state to make positive images of China moving forward. This has to be a good country. It's not, by the way, not the only country that uses or interacts with art and literature in this way. So here's the real picture. Actually, it's not all Chinese minorities, and you got some random people in the background. I'm going to end on this slide because I've run out of time. But basically, I wanted to open up this discussion to add in a little bit more of the story of politics, and to make the argument that China is particularly successful given its history and also given its political climate to having a strong element of politicalization of art. And we saw with the Charlie Chaplin speech that can be something really beautiful about working together and being these kinds of things. But at the same time, one starts to worry about what that means for artists and also what that means for the politics between art and literature. Make sense?
Thank you.
Sorry.
So now we have about 5 minutes for Q&A. We open the floor for questions. Anyone wants to wait?
Definitely went over. Sorry about that.
Okay, so maybe first, I would like to just other for you. Okay, so would you like to first respond to each other's remarks and any comments? Yeah.
I had one thing.
I have a comment, just to Ivan's presentation. It's as though he had prepped me, because I have this wonderful quote here from George Steiner, who published a collection. He obviously is dead now. He published a collection of wonderful essays and reviews that was very recently translated into Chinese as 语言与沉默, language and silence. And it made a huge splash in literary communities. And when you read it, it becomes clear why it carries so much cultural cachet in China right now. So this is George Steiner, and he's talking about Marxist art, Marxist literary theory. In a communist society, the poet is regarded as a figure central to the health of the body politic. Such regard is cruelly manifest in the very urgency with which the heretical artist is silenced or hounded to destruction, which of course we just saw with Ai Weiwei, etc. etc. This constant preoccupation with the life of the mind would alone serve to distinguish Marxist autocracy from other species of totalitarianism. To shoot a man because one disagrees with his interpretation of Darwin or Hegel is a sinister tribute to the supremacy of ideas in human affairs, but a tribute nevertheless. I think he hits it exactly on the head. That's exactly what's going on. There is the double-edged short sword of the CCP, the Communist Party, taking art very, very seriously. Much more seriously, one could argue, than we take it here in the United States. And because of that, wanting to have control of it. And that is very much, you know, it is a deadly tribute, but a tribute nevertheless.
That was a lot better than my whole presentation. He said it in 2 minutes too.
Hi, I'm Karen. I'm a sophomore and also one of the organizing members of the symposium. My question goes out to Mr. Rasmussen specifically. About this time last year, we actually had a short conversation in which you discussed some of your research about China's use of soft power abroad. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to the role that the intersection of art and politics plays in that projection.
This is a really good question. Well, so I went back to the pretty image up there, right? So I'm gonna try. I'll try and keep this as short as possible, but because it's extremely complicated. I think that what you're dealing with, first of all, is and Professor Wang can correct me and add nuance to this, is not just Chinese soft power as a unitary actor, but as we talked about it in the past, as bunch of different actors doing soft power. And the general argument is soft power, by the way, for people who don't know it too well, is the idea of kind of promoting the image of the country abroad to improve relations, that kind of stuff. It's a Jonai concept, right? I'm making it very, very simplified for the audience. But there are multiple actors. So you have like Ministry of Foreign Affairs, you have just like all these different actors doing it. But you can also have like individual actors doing it. And so, to some degree, the artist world, which I'm not as hooked up into since I lived in Beijing a couple of years ago, but the artist world is also doing its own kind of soft power, but it is a little bit more critical of the Chinese government. I would say, ironically, that works better as a message than this message right here. In terms of soft power, it's more believable, right? The artist is going to be critical. That's what they do, right? To some degree. Anyway, I don't know enough about the intersection of the art world and soft power, but all I would say is, ironically, I'd say that they're making a slightly more credible kind of show, but at the same time, they're also self-interested and trying to make a lot of money off of this. Ai Weiwei is making money off of his dominance of being that thing, and it's an interesting kind of dichotomy. I don't know if I get the answer, but thanks, Ken.
Okay, so we have one more question.
There's one right here too.
Oh, thank you. So,
I have a question for Eleanor and Pamela. So I think you guys, so all speakers mentioned that there's a sense of humiliation, especially for writers and artists, both like previously, but now I was thinking that with the continuing rising position of Chinese economic and political power on the world stage, do you think that the subject matter or ways of expression for the writers and artists in China will experience a shift in the future? Maybe their tone will not be as bitter, or maybe sort of the subject matter will change in the future.
I'll leave Professor Wang to speak to the visual art world, but certainly in the literary world that has already happened. Last year I was in Beijing doing a project translating, sort of collating and translating 80后. So, poets who were born in the 80s, and 90后. It's terrifying, there's 90后now. So these very, very young writers, and I was working with primarily poets, and they are already not talking about 要食物啊, or or 吃苦, 咽下什么的. They're highly educated. A lot of them have already studied abroad or have plans to study abroad. Their English is very good. They're reading things in English, French, Spanish, Russian. They read much, much more widely than their contemporaries here in the United States. They know the Peruvian poetry and are influenced by it. So there's already been a kind of enormous opening up and expansion in the territory of literary output. And I think that will continue. I would say the one area where there still is a little bit of resentment, and in my opinion it is warranted, is the fact that there is much, much more literature than is translated, often completely ineptly, but nevertheless translated into Chinese and published in China, than there is Chinese literature being translated and published in the West. I mean, it's absolutely, there's no comparison. So the Chinese are much more aware of what's going on in the rest of the world than the rest of the world is aware of what is going on in China. And that is a source of resentment, and I think rightfully so.
I'll just add to that, that for the younger generation, there isn't, I would agree, there isn't really that same dialogue or conversation as you mentioned. In fact, because they were born in the 80s or 90s, and because the market is doing so well, really weathered, everyone keeps thinking the bubble's gonna burst, but in fact, and like sometimes it does wane, it's like not $12 million, but it's $10 million or whatever things are being sold for, but these young artists are being scooped right out of their senior art shows. They're doing very, very well. And some people, older artists, will critique that maybe they haven't had time to mature or whatnot, but without a doubt the system has been created and has just thrived in this way that they don't have to suffer really as much. They're doing very, very well.
You've all in various ways kind of shown how, if you like, dissident, using a very general word, networks have kind of exploited gaps in the system, or networks, local lineage, roots of religion, or friends and relations of artists, or whatever. Are you saying, I mean, and they've also been tolerated, in the sense they haven't been crushed. Is there a sign that the party is moving from a feeling of tolerance to one of acceptance and welcoming and developing? Or are these people, I mean, are they deliberately dissident? Do they want to become mainstream? And how are the authorities responding in that sense? Is their attitude towards them changing?
I would actually say there's a pushback to because of the Ai Weiwei situations and things of that sort, and that's the view of artists as dissident, that people push back against being even termed dissident. There's actually a lot of pushback against any sort of labeling whatsoever. Why are we called contemporary Chinese artists, not just contemporary artists? You don't have like contemporary French art, exhibitions, why are we all grouped together in this way? So there's a lot of just kind of a discussion of I want to be post-national, I want to be post-gender, I don't want to be a contemporary Chinese female artist, because there are assumptions that go along with that. And so the dissident label has, people are trying to remove it in a lot of ways too. I don't know if that's necessarily answering your question.
I think just a quick response. I think on the religious front, I think we have to be very careful. I think most of the time, I don't think the Chinese government really speak with one voice when they deal with religion, arts, or maybe any other cultural elements. So in a way, I think the levels of tolerance it actually shift over time. And the other thing when we think about art and also maybe religion in general, I think all these elements also contain a strong culture of dissent, at a very much individual level. So in a way, I think even though the state have that kind of infrastructure, but they can't really change the mindset or the moral landscape of the religious and also the artistic community. So you always have that kind of interesting tension between the state's glorification and also some kind of ongoing critique of the everyday life.
Guys, I hate to cut this off, but we keep to. This is a great discussion. We do have our keynote at 12:30, so I want to give everybody a chance to grab some lunch before then. So yeah, also there are breakout sessions, sign-ups outside. It's workshops where you can, in the smaller setting, talk with some individuals who have research for the Tufts International Relations Journal. So it's a great chance to encourage you all to sign up.
And also you're welcome to talk with speakers after the panel for questions of our discussion. Thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thank you. No, I had whenever you were talking about performance art and sorry, I'm over. It's all right, don't worry, these things always go over.